The late October sky hung low, tinged with hues of orange and purple as the sun sank toward the horizon. Long shadows sprawled across the overgrown grass of Greenwood Cemetery, where ancient gravestones jutted from the earth like crooked teeth. A cool breeze tugged at the branches of barren trees, whispering through the leaves that littered the ground. The place reeked of decay and stillness, save for the distant sound of crows echoing from the nearby woods. Max knelt beside the fresh grave, his eyes misting over as he traced the letters of Dylan's name with trembling fingers. The loss of his best friend felt raw, unreal. It had only been a few weeks since the accident, but time seemed meaningless in the face of his grief. Every day felt heavier, darker. Behind him, Ella shifted on her feet, arms crossed tightly against her chest. She wiped away a tear and took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. She hated crying in front of others, especially here, in front of the boys. Her pale face was a mask of control, but her red-rimmed eyes betrayed the pain gnawing at her. Jordan and Casey stood further back, the silence between them thick with unspoken grief. Jordan kicked at the dirt, his shoulders hunched as if the weight of the world pressed down on him. Casey glanced nervously at the sinking sun, her thumb scrolling through her phone absent-mindedly. The setting was getting too eerie for her liking. Max's voice broke the silence, low and hoarse. "I still can't believe he's gone. It's like he was just here, you know? He was supposed to graduate with us, go to college, live his life." Ella sniffled, swallowing hard. "I feel like any second now, he's going to walk up behind us and laugh at how serious we're being." She forced a sad smile, but it faded just as quickly. Jordan's voice was barely a whisper, thick with emotion. Dylan would have hated this, us standing around all. Depressing. Casey shifted her weight, biting her lip. Her phone buzzed in her hand, but she ignored it. Instead, her eyes brightened slightly as an idea struck her. "Guys," she said slowly, her voice tentative, "what if we didn't have to say goodbye just yet?" The group turned to her, confused. "What are you talking about?" Max asked, his brow furrowed. Casey hesitated, glancing down at her phone before meeting their gazes. "I've been looking into something, a way to maybe contact him. It's a ritual I found online. We could try to reach Dylan, talk to him, just for one last time." Ella recoiled, her face tightening. "What? No, that's insane, Casey. You don't mess with stuff like that." Jordan crossed his arms, giving her a skeptical look. "A ritual? Seriously? You can't be buying into that garbage." Max, however, looked thoughtful, his eyes darting to Dylan's grave and then back to Casey. Grief gnawed at him, the thought of hearing his friend's voice again tempting him beyond reason. "What kind of ritual?" he asked quietly. Casey's face lit up with nervous excitement. "It's simple. We light some candles, say a few words, and wait for a sign. People have done it to contact lost loved ones. I know it sounds crazy, but what if it worked? What if we could actually talk to Dylan?" Ella's voice trembled, a mixture of fear and anger in her tone. "You can't be serious, Max. This isn't right." "We don't know what we're messing with." Max glanced down at Dylan's name again, his heart tightening. The grief was unbearable, suffocating. The idea of a final goodbye, no matter how strange or dangerous, was enough to push him over the edge. What do we have to lose? If it doesn't work, nothing happens. But if it does, his voice trailed off. Jordan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Fine, but if anything weird starts happening, we're out." Ella swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable, but reluctantly nodded. "I don't like this," she muttered. "But I guess if it'll help you guys move on." Casey's fingers moved quickly, scrolling through the webpage again. "We need candles," she said. pulling 4 small tea lights from her bag. "And we need to light them around his grave." The others exchanged nervous glances, but no one backed out. One by one, they helped her arrange the candles at the corners of the headstone. As Casey flicked the lighter, the small flames flickered to life, casting a dim, eerie glow across the gravestone. The light twisted and danced in the breeze, making the shadows seem to come alive. The atmosphere thickened, the chill in the air becoming more pronounced. Max felt the weight of what they were doing, and his hands shook slightly as he watched the flickering flames. It was unsettling, the way the graveyard seemed to grow quieter, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Casey read from her phone, her voice soft but firm. "Dylan, if you can hear us, we ask you to show us a sign. We are your friends, and we want to talk to you one last time. Come back to us, even for just a moment." Max, Jordan, and Ella repeated the words after her, though Ella's voice was shaky and uncertain. The wind picked up slightly, sending a shiver down Max's spine. The atmosphere had changed. The air felt charged, as if something unseen was stirring. Nothing happened at first. The candles flickered, the wind rustled the leaves, but the graveyard remained quiet. Max's heart sank a little, disappointment tugging at him. Of course, it wasn't going to work. It had been foolish to even try. But then, a faint whisper, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind, drifted through the air. Max froze, his heart skipping a beat. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jordan's eyes widened. "Yeah, I think I did." Ella stiffened, her arms hugging herself tighter. "It was just the wind," she said, though her voice trembled with doubt. But then it came again, a whisper, clearer this time, like a voice carried on the wind. It was low, indistinct, but undeniably there. Max's pulse quickened, his breath catching in his throat. "Dylan?" he called out, his voice trembling. The candles flickered, their flames dancing wildly in the wind, and suddenly, all at once, they went out. The graveyard plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint, dying glow of the setting sun. A cold, biting chill swept over them, much colder than before. Max felt it in his bones, a sharp, unnatural cold that sent a shiver down his spine. He looked at the others. Jordan's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear, while Ella's lips quivered, her hands trembling at her sides. "Casey," Ella said, her voice shaking, "I think we need to stop. This doesn't feel right." But Casey didn't seem to hear her. She stared at the gravestone, her eyes wide, almost entranced. "Dylan?" she whispered, her voice filled with hope. "Is that you?" The wind picked up again, howling through the trees, and the whisper returned, louder this time, clearer. But it wasn't Dylan's voice. It was deeper, colder, a voice that crawled under their skin. "You shouldn't have come," it hissed, the words dripping with malice. Max's blood ran cold. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his feet felt glued to the ground. This wasn't Dylan. This was something else, something they had invited by mistake. The ground beneath them seemed to tremble, a low rumble that Max could feel in his chest. The dirt at the foot of Dylan's grave began to shift, as if something underneath was stirring. A dark mist seeped from the soil, curling around their feet, cold and unnatural. "We need to go," Max said, his voice barely steady. "Now." Ella didn't need to be told twice. She turned and began backing away, her breath coming in panicked gasps. Jordan followed her, his face pale with fear. But Casey stayed rooted to the spot, her eyes still locked on the grave. "Wait," she said, her voice desperate. "It could still be him. It's not Dylan." Max shouted, grabbing her arm and yanking her back. "We need to get out of here before." The whispering grew louder, more insistent, the voice warping into a guttural growl. "You are not welcome here." The mist swirled thicker around them, rising up like tendrils of smoke. Max felt something cold brush against his leg like a hand, but wrong. Clammy and icy. He gasped, pulling back, his heart pounding in his chest. "Run!" he shouted. They bolted, stumbling over gravestones and tripping on the uneven ground. Max's lungs burned as he ran, but the fear pushing him forward was stronger than the pain. Behind him, he heard Casey scream, a blood-curdling sound that froze his blood. Max skidded to a stop, his heart in his throat. He turned to see Casey on the ground, the mist wrapping around her legs, pulling her back toward the grave. "Help me!" she shrieked, her hands clawing at the dirt as she tried to free herself. Max's feet felt like lead, but he forced himself to move, running back toward her. He grabbed her arms, pulling with all his strength, but the mist was stronger, relentless. Casey's eyes widened in terror, her breath coming in frantic gasps as the mist tightened around her. "Let go of her," Max yelled, pulling harder. "Let her go." But the mist only thickened, pulling Casey further toward the grave. Max could feel the icy cold of it seeping into his skin, numbing his hands as he tried to hold on. "Casey, don't let go," he shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. But the mist surged, yanking her free from his grasp. Casey screamed, her voice echoing through the graveyard as she was dragged back toward the grave. Max lunged after her, but the mist rose up, forming a dark, twisted shape that blocked his path. The thing was huge, towering over him, its form barely human. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. "You should not have come," it hissed, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. Max stumbled back, his heart racing. He wanted to fight, to save Casey, but his body wouldn't move. He was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. The thing reached for Casey, its hand closing around her throat. She gasped, her eyes wide with terror, but no sound escaped her lips. The mist swirled tighter, enveloping her completely. And then, with a final, horrible scream, Casey was gone. Max swallowed hard, his throat dry. He turned to the others, his voice barely a whisper. "We need to go." Without another word, they turned and fled, the weight of what they had unleashed chasing them into the night. Weeks later, Max sat on his bed, staring blankly at the ceiling. The silence of his room pressed down on him, thick and suffocating. Sleep had become a distant memory. Every time he closed his eyes, the screams echoed back to him, dragging him into a nightmare that felt far too real. He hadn't heard from Jordan or Ella since that night in the graveyard. They all avoided each other, pretending life could go on, but deep down, Max knew the truth. They were haunted. The empty space Casey had left behind was a wound that refused to heal. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. Max ignored it at first, his eyes shut tight as if willing himself to push away the memories. But the buzzing persisted, louder and more urgent. Finally, he picked it up. The screen glowed in the dim light, and his heart sank as he saw the name. Casey. His fingers trembled as he opened the message, a single line that sent a chill down his spine. "I never left." Max dropped the phone, his breath caught in his throat. He stared at the screen as it dimmed, his mind racing. Suddenly, the temperature in his room plummeted, his breath visible in the icy air. The shadows around him seemed to shift, stretching toward him like fingers. He looked around, his chest tightening in fear. From the corner of the room, where the darkness was deepest, a familiar voice whispered a voice he never thought he'd hear again. "Max." It was Casey. Her voice was soft but filled with something unrecognizable, something not quite right. Max's skin prickled as he turned, his eyes wide and searching the shadows. "Casey?" he called out, his voice cracking. The air thickened, heavy with an unseen presence, and suddenly she was there, a figure standing just at the edge of the room. Casey's face, but not quite. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids that swallowed the light, and her mouth was twisted in a faint, eerie smile. "You left me," she whispered, stepping closer, her footsteps making no sound. Max's pulse raced. "No, Casey, I tried to... You let me die." Her voice cut through the air, sharper than before. He stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. I didn't want." "It doesn't matter." Casey's form wavered, shifting like smoke. "I'm not alone anymore." Max felt something cold brush against his neck, as if icy fingers were trailing along his skin. His eyes widened as the room darkened, shadows pooling around his feet. Suddenly, the air was filled with whispers, low, rasping voices overlapping, growing louder. He could feel them pressing in, suffocating him. His mind raced with panic as the walls seemed to close in. And then, just as quickly as it started, the whispers stopped. The room fell into an unnatural stillness. Casey's figure faded into the darkness, her voice lingering in the air. "We're always here, Max, always." The silence that followed was deafening. Max's phone lay on the floor, its screen black, but the message, the truth, was already burned into his mind. He wasn't sure what haunted him more, the voices in the graveyard, or the fact that they were never really gone. They never would be.